Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Garfield. Happy birthday to you. The comic strip Garfield by Jim Davis turns 40 years old today or yesterday. I'm not quite sure. So, happy birthday. Anyway, it's been a couple of days since I've done a video about my art project. I'm afraid I caught a bit of a summer cold or perhaps an allergy attack from my visit last weekend to Ashborough. But despite the sniffles, that didn't stop me from drawing a lot and reading comics. But I wasn't really in a good place to make videos. I will point out there has been a change to the art studio. I have found the old turntable, and I have set it up here. It seems to work, and I have a whole bunch of old records, LPs, and so I will be experimenting with the records. I'll be showing my nieces and nephews how this device works. It will be a lot of fun. Anyway, we won't talk about records now. Let me show you the comics I've been reading, and then I'll show you an update on my sketchbook. Anyway, I read the next chapter in this history of the comic strip, The Funnies, and this chapter deals with basically the late 1920s to early 1930s, and this is the rise of the adventure comic strip. So comics have already established themselves as a gag machine, and they've already become part of the middle-class American experience. And so the next step was more complicated storytelling. During this time period, a lot of comic strips that of which we are more familiar today made their debut. Some of them may only be known to comic enthusiasts, but I think at least the names are familiar. So we have Barney Google with the googly eyes. That actually was a hit song, I think in the late 1920s. I could probably find it on YouTube. I mostly remember Barney Google because his horse Sparkplug is where Charles Schulz got his nickname Sparky. I think his great uncle, seeing baby Charles Schulz, said, "Hey, he's got googly eyes. Let's call him Sparky," something like that. And actually, in the recent CGI Peanuts movie, Charlie Brown had a Sparkplug comic book in his locker. Barney Google also spawned the Snuffy Sniff comics. So anyway, some of these are familiar, and some of these are a little less familiar. Now, in the 1920s, we saw the rise of the flapper heroine. Well, by the late 20s and early 30s, we have the rise of the aviator hero, obviously inspired by Lindbergh. Now, this book doesn't mention it, but probably the most famous aviator hero is actually Mickey Mouse. If you'll remember the original cartoon by Ub Iwerks and Walt Disney, Mickey Mouse is in the farm, and I think he builds his airplane and goes on adventures. And so they established Mickey Mouse as a farm boy with big dreams. And if you remember those early black and white cartoons, Mickey Mouse is a bit of a rogue or a prankster. He definitely does things which Mickey Mouse would not do 20 years later. He's a bit of a... Well, he's half Charlie Chaplin, half Lindbergh. He's actually a little bit like Popeye, too. We'll talk about Mickey Mouse later. Mickey Mouse doesn't really feature in this book. Now, one thing that is really important, the book only has a few paragraphs about this, is Seagar's famous cartoon strip, Thimble Theater. Thimble Theater started out as one thing, and then it later became the other thing, and the other thing it became was Popeye the Sailor Man. Now, one thing I like about Seagar's work, see if I can find an example, is that it looks very much like outsider art, in that it is unique and perhaps a little rough, but extremely expressive. It almost makes me think that if Henry Darger were a comic strip artist with the Vivian Girls, perhaps his comic would have looked a little bit like this. Henry Darger is definitely an artist I would like to discuss at another time. He is, well, he was a fascinating individual, and I don't know, there's a lot to say about him, and a lot of kind of contradictory things about him. Very interesting. He's not a comic strip artist. He was sort of an outsider artist slash sort of a novelist in a way. Anyway, another comic strip that started this time was Little Orphan Annie. And the Little Orphan Annie still exists today. There is a modern day continuation of it, which I've been meaning to get into for a while. I know you can read it on Go Comics. I just haven't had a chance. There actually were a lot of other orphan comic strips. Some of them were imitators. Some of them, it was just kind of part of that time period. But Annie stuck it out. Let's see, what else do we have? Some other adventure comic strips. Here's an early Orphan Annie. That's an excellent card there. These old comic strips were extremely expressive. I mean, the artists definitely came from illustrative backgrounds, and they also had more room to work with. So, I mean, they are very, very beautiful. I kind of wish these old comic strips were republished in more of a manga format. You know, take this down, put that here, maybe the next part of the next daily, and then kind of blow it up a little bit, and then you can kind of just read it like a novel. Because this type is too small, although it wouldn't have been that small in the original. Let's see. Okay, now this is interesting. So a lot of famous novels, or at least famous works of fiction, were adapted somewhat into comic strip form. We're talking The Taming of the Shrew and The Golden Bough, but it looks like this is kind of ridiculous. Let's see. I don't know if I can find the passage, but you know, some of these novels were condensed into, you know, just a dozen weeks or so. So you'd basically have an illustration and a wall of text beside it or underneath it, rather than making use of the comic strip medium. So, for instance, this passage gives an example of Oliver Twist asking for more food, and it's this huge wall of text. We don't have the picture. This should have been illustrated with, you know, a couple of days worth of visuals. We should see how hungry he is, and the other boys are egging him on to ask for more, and you know, we see expressions on their face, and then sort of the least amount of dialogue that we need to make that work. All right, a lot of these are not familiar today. Buck Rogers. I've actually never read the Buck Rogers comic strip. I would like to one day. I did read the original pulp story, which was unrefined, shall we say. Gasoline Alley. I know Gasoline Alley continued for a long time. That would be another interesting comic strip to research. Tarzan of the Apes. Tarzan is interesting. I mean, I'm familiar with the original novels. I think I listened to a reading of Tarzan a few months ago. I'm not really sure. The thing with novels like Tarzan or The Hobbit, it's you know, they get reread so often. I kind of forget when was the last time I heard it. It's just sort of always somewhere in my mind. But there were kind of a struggle to get that into comic strip form, and once again, it was extremely condensed. The novel was broken down into 60 dailies. And that's ridiculous. So basically, in 10 weeks, telling a whole novel. No, you know, it spent a year and a half or 2 years to bring a novel to comics form. Comics are a visual medium. But of course, I'm looking at it with the hindsight of a creator living 100 years after this time period. Almost 100 years. I guess, okay, and then the final one is Joe Palooka. I've actually never read Joe Palooka. I mostly know about Joe Palooka because that's where we get the word palooka, which is a funny bit of American vocabulary. And as we've seen in our journey through this book, a lot of vocabulary came from comics. All right. Now, these two books I got from the Comic Conspiracy in Ashboro. I wanted to look at some children's comics. Rocky and Bullwinkle. Now, Rocky and Bullwinkle, of course, is a classic cartoon show from I want to say the 1960s. Let's just take a minute to talk about this. What's interesting about Rocky and Bullwinkle is that in many ways it was what The Simpsons were to the 1990s, Rocky and Bullwinkle were to the 1960s, albeit to a lesser extent, in the sense that, and also the Flintstones to some extent, but in the sense that they were able to satirize and comment on things happening in America at the time period, and actually in a very intelligent way. I think if you watch Rocky Bullwinkle as an adult, one will find a lot more humor and subtlety to it, and of course a lot of really stupid puns and a lot of dumb things in it also, just sort of whimsical things, I suppose. Satire is a very old thing. I mean, the Romans famously declare that satire was the genre they invented. And not to get too far afield on talking about satire, satire tends to be a lot older than people imagine it. I remember when the film Shrek came out, people thought, "Oh, this is so revolutionary." Someone satirizing fairy tales, and of course, most of us who knew anything about fairy tales knew that that was not the case. Fairy tale theater had done something very similar to Shrek in a more substantial way. I want to say in the 1980s. We of course have fractured fairy tales with Rocky Bullwinkle in the 1960s, but we can even go back further than that. I believe children's literature in the 19th century was, if not satirizing, at least commenting on fairy tales. In some ways, Alice's Adventures in The Adventures of Alice in Wonderland is, in some ways, a satire of children's literature of that time period, and a little bit of fairy tale. Some fairy tale elements do feature into that book and its sequel. Perhaps, I guess the most famous satirical fairy tale is The Wizard of Oz. It is so satirical that I don't even think today that we are aware of how satirical it is. What's great about The Wizard of Oz is that it Baum not only understands the fairy tale, but he writes a fairy tale. So the book itself deconstructs, I hate the word deconstruct, let's just say it understands the tropes and elements of a fairy tale, and while commenting on those, makes its own fairy tale. So the elements of A Wizard of Oz, the three people searching for something they already had, is very fairy tale-like, and of course fighting a witch. But the subversion, of course, is that the wizard himself is a humbug, albeit a very kind one, and that Dorothy is not a princess or a peasant, but just a regular American girl. I could talk for hours about The Wizard of Oz. Basically, every page of The Wizard of Oz is worthy of a discussion, but we'll do that at another time, perhaps. Peter Pan is also a little bit of a satire of fairy tale. But the point is that fairy tales and children's literature in general has been satirized for generations, and one of the best examples, of course, is Rocky and Bullwinkle. So this was printed in 1972, so of course we have advertisements for BB guns, and the story is basically Rocky becoming a singer, a little bit like the Beatles or the Monkees, and we have shouting girls. So this is definitely a satire of the American youth, American music, and American television in the late 60s. And then Peabody and Sherman go and have shenanigans with Julius Caesar. They get him to cross the Rubicon. And in some ways, Peabody and Sherman don't just satirize. It's not so much a comment on history, it's a comment on how we view history and how history has become folklore. Julius Caesar is not meant to be the historical figure, he's the folkloric figure. And then we go to the fair and we have shenanigans with Boris and Natasha, and then finally we get to a fairy tale Fractured Fairy Tale, Jack and the Beanstalk. Okay, but anyway, I just kind of wanted to point out how old satire really goes. This other children's comic I got from the Comic Conspiracy was definitely a children's comic, also I believe from the 1970s. Now some 1984. Some Disney comics have beautiful artwork, like Carl Barks's work with Donald Duck. This is more workman-like. This is not Carl Barks. This is very simple and meant for younger readers. And once again, this is a satire. In this case, Goofy is satirizing the superhero, the generic superhero. In this case, sort of the Superman figure. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I was showing you a reprint of some vintage comics, and one of them, whose name escapes me at the moment, from the 1940s, was a satire of Superman. So Superman was already the source of comment within a few years of his original publication, and then we see a knight and dragon and the dragon version of Goofy. The only other thing I want to mention about this is that there is one story involves someone stealing time, and this reminded me of the classic Twilight Zone episode with I think maybe it was a stopwatch where some thieves were able to stop time and then do naughty things, or stealing from a bank or something. Alright, so sketchbook time. I think I only have about 30 pages left in the sketchbook. I'm just doing the line art right now, and then I will be spending all of July painting this sketchbook, the sketchbook I'm making for the State Fair, and sort of a practice sketchbook. So all of July I'll be painting the line art. I think I'll finish the line art by Friday or Saturday, and then I've got a few more pages left in another sketchbook, and then I'll just be painting like a painting fool. But anyway, I hope to have more regular updates, both on my comic reading and what I'm drawing. All right, I'll talk to you later. Goodbye.